What's up, Psychedelic Investors? My name's James, and you're watching The Psychedelic Investor, your #1 news source for psychedelic stocks. Today, I have the pleasure of bringing you This Week in Psychedelic Stocks for the trading week ending on April 9th. And actually, because there was so much news this week, we're going to split it into 2 different episodes. Today, we're going to cover all the general sector-wide news, and then tomorrow, we're going to bring you all the industry-specific news. So if you enjoy this new format, please let me know down in the comments, and we will keep it going forward. And if you don't enjoy it, also let me know, and we will discard it. So today, we have lots of news to get through. We're going to start up with 3 different studies that all got released this week. The first one is going to look at the effects of treating depression with psilocybin. The second one is looking at the effects of taking psychedelics in a large group of people, a ritual setting. And finally, we're going to look at another microdosing study. So once we're wrapped up with all those studies, we're going to look at an update on Americans' ability to buy the Horizons Psych ETF. And finally, we're going to give you some updates on some decriminalization efforts that are happening across the United States. So if you enjoy this episode, make sure you invest in the channel with your like and subscribe. Over time, you'll see your investment grow as we continue to bring you the information that you need to know before investing in the psychedelic medicine space. Enjoy the episode. Our first story today is that we have a new study looking at the effects of treating depression with psilocybin, and that is set to be released next week. Specifically on April 14th, the paper will drop in the New England Journal of Medicine, a very prestigious paper, and the study was conducted by the Center for Psychedelic Research, an arm of the Imperial College of London. Specifically, the paper will look at the effectiveness and side effects of psilocybin in individuals with major depressive disorder, as compared to a control group on SSRIs, a standard method for treating depression right now. So, even though the paper isn't yet public, we know a little bit about it because the head of the Center for Psychedelic Research, a guy named Robin Carhart Harris, has been tweeting about it since Thursday. So we're just going to go ahead and throw that Twitter feed up on the screen and we can read it together, shall we? He says that the trial was a 2-arm double-blind randomized control trial in 59 people with major depressive disorder, 30 in what we call the psilocybin group, and 29 in the other. I won't reveal the results until they are published, but merely brief on the design. In the psilocybin condition, there are 2 25 mg dosing sessions separated by 3 weeks. Prep, guide supervision of sessions, and post-dose integration were done as standard. In addition, patients took placebo capsules daily for 6 weeks, 1 capsule per day for the first 3 weeks, and 2 capsules per day in the final 3 weeks. In the escitalopram group, and by the way, that just means an SSRI, I know I screwed up how to say that, doesn't matter, moving on. In the SSRI group, patients had 2 1 mg dosing sessions separated by 3 weeks. Skipping ahead a bit, our primary hypothesis was that the mechanisms would differ. We also performed fMRI and MRI in the trial at baseline and at 6-week endpoint. In fact, pre-reg primary outcome was on these fMRI, with the kids' SR16 as the primary efficacy outcome. We don't report on brain mechanisms in the paper, under analysis, but do show multiple secondary efficacy outcomes, particularly in the supplementary appendix, which I implore you to read, and that is in all caps. More tomorrow. So, we don't yet have too many details on this trial, and most importantly, whether or not psilocybin was even effective in treating MDD, major depressive disorder, but this will be an important study when it is released. Several public companies, the most prominent of which, of course, is Compass Pathways, are working on treating depression with psilocybin, so the results of this study will reverberate throughout the psychedelic investing world. Now, having said that, this is a small sample size, so regardless of whether the results are positive or negative, you're going to have to take them with a grain of salt. They won't be definitive. But if they do come back very positive, my confidence levels both in Compass and the wider sector in general will be greatly boosted. For our next story today, we have another study from the Imperial College of London. And it seems like almost every study that we bring to you guys has been by the Imperial College of London recently, so major props to their team. And this particular one is very interesting. It looks at the effects of taking psychedelics in a group setting, such as in a ceremony or ritual. And the results of the study are quite frankly amazing. But before we get to that, before we talk about the results, I'll briefly go over how this study was conducted and some of the limitations to it. So this study looked at self-reported data from 886 people who were already intending to partake in a psychedelic group ceremony using a compound like ayahuasca or psilocybin. So the participants in the study, they filled out 5 questionnaires, the first 2 weeks before the event, the second hours before the ceremony, the third the day after the ritual, the fourth the following day, and the fifth 4 weeks after that. And on this questionnaire, they asked questions on topics like psychological well-being, social connectiveness, depressive symptoms, anxiety, and tolerance towards others. So what's important to note here is that there can be lots of biases at play in this study, such as the self-selection sampling bias, and since it wasn't really done in a clinical setting, there's only so much usefulness we can glean from this. But despite all that, the results are pretty phenomenal. So I'm just going to go ahead and read you a couple lines from this paper. In particular, post-psychedelic improvements in well-being, social connectiveness, depressive symptoms, trait anxiety, and interpersonal tolerance were found to be positively associated with the extent of communitas experienced during psychedelic ceremonies, demonstrating the predictive validity of here proposed instrument. It is worth noting that absolute change in effect size for post-psychedelic well-being increase were approximately 2 and 1.5 times higher in the current study than in structurally similar samples, suggesting that psychedelics used in guided collective environments may, on certain occasions, provide an added advantage for the prevention and treatment of mental health problems. So in other words, this study found that taking psychedelics in a group setting, in a ceremonial setting, was up to twice as effective as in a one-on-one clinical setting. I'm just going to go ahead and read you guys one more quote from this paper. It says, "The strongest association between any long-term outcome and communitas was observed for social connectiveness, pointing to the ability of positive relational experiences during psychedelic ceremonies to induce a sense of belongingness beyond the context of the immediate social environment. Social connectiveness is a well-established determinant of both mental and physical health." So, obviously, this study needs to be repeated, needs to be replicated, perhaps with more stringent controls, definitely with in-person researchers on the ground. We don't want this to be taking place online like this one currently was. But despite all of these limitations, the results are amazing. They get me very excited. And most companies in the field are currently focused on one-on-one experiences, psychologist and patient, but there is at least one public company, NovaMind, which is planning on holding therapeutic psychedelic retreats, and I believe this will be done in groups. And I don't actually know too much about how this will work. I haven't had time to do too much research into NovaMind yet, but I thought I would give them a shout out in light of this new study by the Imperial College of London. The last study we're going to touch on today was published in the Journal of Psychedelic Studies, and it showed that microdosing psychedelic drugs is associated with increases in conscientiousness and decreases in neuroticism. Again, this was done through self-reporting, so there may be some biases in this, and only 24 participants actually took place in this, so obviously not a large sample size. On top of this, all the participants had microdosed before, so there probably was a little bit of self-selection bias here as well. But with those caveats in mind, the study measured changes in conscientiousness, which is a personality trait of being careful or diligent, neuroticism, which is when you perceive the world to be dangerous, unsafe, and threatening, agreeableness, how agreeable you are, openness, which is how open-minded and curious a person you are, extroversion, which is how extroverted the person behaves, and alexithymia, which is the inability to recognize and describe one's emotions. And I think I'm saying that right, but it doesn't really matter if I'm not. So, top line here, the study found that after at least 1 month of microdosing, we observed significant increases in conscientiousness and decreases in neuroticism. On top of that, agreeableness, extroversion, and openness was unaffected, and extroversion was positively correlated with participants' number of lifetime doses and the duration of their prior microdosing experiences. So, in other words, the longer they had been microdosing for, the more extroverted they are. And neuroticism was negatively correlated with the duration of prior microdosing experiences, or in other words, the longer you microdose, the less neurotic you are. So, take this for what it's worth. I decided to bring it to your attention even though it was a small study and there's lots of potential for biases in this. But it does have some positive results, and yes, you have to take them with a grain of salt, but it does kind of lend credence to all the anecdotal evidence when it comes to microdosing. So I just thought I would share the study with you guys, especially in light of the study that was done a few weeks ago by the Imperial College of London, which showed that microdosing psychedelics, the effects of that were mostly due to the placebo effect. Again, I think there's lots of problems in both studies, lots of potential for biases in both studies, but I just thought I would share that with you guys right now. Moving on, our next story today is that Americans can now kinda, sorta, almost buy the Horizons Psychedelic Medicines ETF. So, for those of you that don't know, just real quickly, the Horizons Psychedelic Stock Index, or Psych, PSYK, is a passively managed ETF traded on the Canadian NEO exchange, and it tracks a basket of psychedelic stocks by market cap. And as of this moment, it is only available to buy in Canada, which is what I've been saying all this time. Now, despite this, it has actually recently been brought to my attention on Reddit, and we're going to go ahead and throw this post up on the screen, that Fidelity has an ETF on the OTC market that just tracks Psych, and it's using the ticker symbol HPSYF. So this is legally unaffiliated with Horizons, but it does more or less track the index. So if you're an American and you want to buy Psych, or you want to buy an ETF for psychedelic medicines, you can search instead for HPSYF. However, note that the price movement might not be the same, as Americans would essentially be buying shares in a company that holds shares of Psych using a vehicle called an ADF. Now, I'm not going to really get into what that means right now, but just know that the price movements between the two might not always be exactly the same. So if there's lots of demand in the States for this, for example, you could see a situation like what happened on April 7th, where HPSYF was actually up almost 6%, while Psych was down by 2%. So basically what happened here was the demand was different in the United States and Canada, and the price movements therefore were different. So I'm just going to go ahead and throw up a couple graphs on the screen right now of the two ETFs' performances since February 17th, when HPSYF went live, and you can see that they more or less follow the same pattern, but just know, if you do buy this, that HPSYF may not be a perfect reflection of Psych. Either way, there's actually going to be a actively managed ETF run by Advisor Shares and traded on the New York Stock Exchange sometime in the future, so soon Americans will have the ability to buy an actual ETF for the psychedelic medicines field, and that's going to make this entire thing moot. So last up, we have a couple stories on some decriminalization efforts. First up, we have some progress on a California bill that would effectively decriminalize the use of psychedelics, and we've actually talked about this before here on the channel, but the bill would remove criminal penalties for possessing or sharing a wide range of psychedelics, including psilocybin mushrooms, DMT, ibogaine, LSD, and MDMA, for adults 21 years and older. As well, it would create a working group to study broader reform, and for psilocybin, the legislation would repeal provisions in California's statute that prohibit the cultivation or transportation of any spores or mycelium capable of producing mushrooms or other material that contain the psychoactive ingredient. So this would essentially legalize the growing of your own magic mushrooms, though of course selling it would still be not legal. So what happened here, the news that we have for you today, is that the Senate has actually, or a Senate committee rather, has approved the bill, though it's still going to need to be voted on by the Senate, their House, and then ultimately be signed by their governor. But this is starting to look like it's really likely to happen, which is really big news for all advocates of psychedelic drugs and the legalization of psychedelic drugs. So, I mean, California is what, like 40 million people? So this is a really big deal if you want to see psychedelics legalized. Next up, we have a story from Massachusetts, and specifically there, the third city, a city called Northampton, has approved psychedelic decriminalizations. So what happened here is the city council passed a resolution that would deprioritize enforcement of laws against the possession of use and distribution of a wide range of psychedelics such as psilocybin and ayahuasca. And it dictates that no government or police funds should be used to enforce laws criminalizing people for using or possessing entheogenic plants and fungi. So this is more good news for ending the war on drugs. And again, this is only affecting a very small population of people, but if we keep getting news like this each and every week, eventually it's going to cover the entire United States. So that's all for today, folks. If you enjoyed the episode, make sure you smash that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really does help us grow. And make sure you stay tuned for tomorrow's episode where we cover some of the company-specific updates. And that's all for today. This is James from the Psychedelic Investor, signing out.